home ownership is out of reach for many Canadians. More are relying on intergenerational wealth as housing prices soar.
Housing is both a human right and a profitable asset. This is what drives housing to become unattainable, because housing is being hoarded by the wealthy, who are able to access multiple homes and rent it out to profit off of, while many struggle to just own one. In many cases, those with the means to afford multiple homes to be put on the market are raising the rent due to climbing rental value. In 2 years alone, Montreal's rental market has seen huge changes.
Saint Laurent was noted as having the lowest rent for a one-bedroom, unfurnished apartment. The same apartment in the same neighborhood now goes for an average of $1,658 as of November 2020. 1.5 million, 900,000, 500,000, 1 million. These are some of the prices you'll be paying for a home on the island of Montreal. The average prices for homes sold in Montreal reached
just above $500,000 in October 2022.
In October 2017, the average was just over $300,000. Housing prices have been steadily increasing over the last few decades. Canada's inflation rate just decreased, but in March, it was the highest it's been in 30 years. Interest rates are now at 3.75%.
That's the highest Bank of Canada overnight rate since early 2008. And interest rates are usually raised in order to combat inflation by increasing the cost of borrowing to slow down consumer spending. And it usually takes a couple years to slow down the economy.
Both inflation and interest rates affect those who have bought or are looking to buy a home.
On one hand, when there's inflation, it does increase the value of the real estate that you're holding. But on the other hand, inflation causes interest rates to go up.
Interest rates affect those looking to borrow from the bank to buy a home, and they also affect homeowners who do not have a fixed interest rate, causing their mortgage payments to increase.
House prices in Montreal are much cheaper than other places in the country, including Toronto or Vancouver.
But those who have saved for years are finding it nearly impossible to buy. Homes they once dreamed of are now far out of their budget.
I've been saving up for a property since I'm 25 years old. And it's also been a goal of mine since my early 20s, because that's really when I was entering the job market. And it was always this question of, I'm going to get a financial advisor. I'm going to start saving up for not only my retirement, but the purchase of my first home. Inevitably, through the fact that tons of people were buying, I started realizing oh, this house that 2 years ago had been this goal that I set for myself as being a possible purchase within my budget, given the salary that I had, was now suddenly 2 salary bands away from what was possible for me. Then you kind of have to be okay, well, I need to make more money. But that's not necessarily something that can change overnight. And you need to really push to make your way even just through 1 salary band, let alone 2.
Home ownership and renting is interconnected. Many get stuck in the rental market as soaring rent prices cause many to put large amounts of their paycheck towards their rent, meaning that less can go towards saving for a down payment. For many, buying a home is an investment, one they hope that they can cash in on in years or in decades. But some are simply trying to seek a permanent roof over their head and escape rent evictions, neglected apartments, and rising rents.
In Canada, we have historically chosen to put a lot of emphasis on home ownership on the one hand, and on the other hand, allow the private market to control most of the supply of rental houses. It doesn't need to be that way. There are a number of other ways of managing and providing housing in Canada. And I think the obvious one is to invest a lot more resources on having a much larger share of the rental market to be outside of the private market, to be a larger share of the renter stock to be not-for-profit housing. You take profits out of the equation, the prices go down. And there's also something to be said that there could be and there should be more regulation on the rental markets as they are right now, the private rental markets. The pretty straightforward solution is to put more controls on rentals.
Tranjan says buying a home was not ever an attainable goal for many. He said most racialized families and people didn't ever expect to afford a home. He says that the mainstream media has put attention on those from white middle-class families now not being able to afford a home.
Throughout history, workers and low and moderate income families had a really hard time accessing good, secure, affordable housing. Housing has been a contentious social, political, and economic area for a very long time.
Tranjan says issues within the housing market are nothing new.
They were created during colonization, when the use of land moved from living off of it to profiting off of it.
Colonialism, in sort of classic Marxist terms, colonialism is a form of primitive accumulation, right? So before you can build a house and own it and trade it as a commodity, often what you have to do is to appropriate that land, usually through, through the means of force. And so that, in that sense, Canada, it was a classic example where there's a first phase of primitive accumulation, how Marxists would call it, where land, where the people who were here were dispossessed, land was turned into a private good, then you build houses on it, and then you start trading it, and you start treating it as a commodity, eventually as a financial asset, and the purpose of land and housing sort of drifts away from other uses. We're more focused on supporting our life and community, and drift towards serving the purposes and the needs of the market.
Can revolutionizing our public housing market be a better way to provide housing?
To make housing accessible for all, we must not only look at it as a human right instead of a commodity to profit off of, but we must also look at who is in need of housing. In many neighborhoods in Canada, zoning rules dictate that the only type of new development allowed is the construction of large homes to replace small homes. But this doesn't necessarily mean that more people can fit in the home or access it, as larger homes mean a greater price tag. In the last provincial election, the CAQ promised to fund 11,700 more social housing units if re-elected. Premier François Legault said 15,000 units that had been put on hold by the former Liberal government are either being built or have already been completed. But provincial housing rights group Frappru reacted to Legault's comments on Twitter, stating that less than a third of those units had already been built, and some of the projects are still threatened by a lack of funding. This shows that we need organizations run by the public, for the public. Are we forced to continue to live in a housing market shaped by a colonial past and present? How can we move away from a profit approach to housing and re-emphasize the focus on housing as a human right, rather than a commodity? We can take inspiration from initiatives happening across the city and the country. Cooperative housing is a non-equity model. Housing cooperatives are a middle ground between renting and owning. Co-ops provide legal protection against forced eviction. There are no landlords or tenants, no need to make a down payment, no rent or mortgage. But little co-op housing has been built in Canada since the 1990s. With almost 12,000 co-ops province-wide, Quebec is the province with the highest number of co-ops in Canada.
Our provincial government has not allocated enough money to support social housing in Quebec, as more fall to homelessness amidst rising rents across the city and the province.
Do you know other housing initiatives that can push us towards viewing housing as a human right?
Are you looking to buy a home? What do you think about the rental market and the buyer's market in Montreal? Let us know below in the comments. To watch the full episode, subscribe to Local 514 on YouTube or follow CUTV Montreal on Facebook.